Alright, so wrapping things up, if this is the first video of mine you're finding in this series, I'll put a link to the first video up there. I suggest kind of going in order because we're kind of building on things as we go. But without further ado, we're finally getting into combo decks. Once again, most of the lists in this video come from Ophthalmoscope. He's on the Discord. If you're not on the Discord, jump on the Discord. Link is down below, but let's get into combos. But first, before we get into combos, what are combos doing? First off, combos are trying to do something quote-unquote unfair. These are kind of outside of the aggro decks, the mid-range, and the stall decks we've talked before, and typically these decks are trying to kill fast. Now, the two decks I'm showing you today are Raindance and 9-Bomb. There are, of course, other combo decks that are more donk decks that are trying to end the game very quickly with some kind of really aggressive start. I'm just showing you the most common ones, the ones that probably have slightly better win rates than the others. So to start things off, we have 9-Bomb. These are kind of the key Pokemon in this list. Now, we've seen Psyduck in the stall video. Now, Psyduck here is not to lock out and close the game. Psyduck is to keep your opponent from playing any trainers. It's here as a disruption piece. So we're using the same kind of attack, that headache attack, but we're doing it early to keep our opponent from playing any trainers before we can kind of lock them out with a lass. Arcanine, of course, is our big attacker. Arcanine, 9-Bomb. Now, this can be set up with a DCE. Notice that how it has a double colorless cost and 2 fire. So we can get this set up in 2 turns if we play it correctly. Now, Arcanine does do some damage to itself. We'll talk more about that when we get into our trainers. But it's a pretty solid stage 1 Pokemon. We can do 80 damage on turn 2. Electrode is the other key piece of this. We do need these. These are integral to our deck. We're looking mostly at the power. We're not really attacking with this, although you can attack with Voltorb. More on that in a little bit. But typically we're using Buzz Zap so we can get 2 fire energy put on our Arcanines so we can do that takedown very quickly. So these are kind of our key pieces. Let's look at some of the trainers we're going to need. Now, Lass is also integral to this deck. We've seen this install, but here we're not using this to save ourselves from decking out. We're using it as a disruption piece, so we're going to be using it to cover ourselves once we've got our combo set up. Now, Maintenance is only a 2 of in this deck, but this is an integral card because we have pieces we're going to need. We can't afford to ditch everything. There are some stuff we're going to have to shuffle back in, so use Maintenances correctly. And then finally, I put Computer Search in here, but really all of our draw is pretty key to our deck. We need all the draw we can get so that we can keep kind of chaining off. Once you play a few games with this, you'll kind of see how it works. But we want to be drawing. We're using item finders, we're using oaks, we're using bills, because we're going deep into our deck and we're not worried about decking out. We're just trying to win quickly. So, what does an ideal turn look like with 9-Bomb? What we need to do on turn 1 is we typically want a Psyduck in the active, and we want to be able to use that headache. We also need a Growlithe and a Voltorb on the bench. Now, this isn't going to happen every time. This is the ideal. Keep that in mind. Where the skill comes in is when you have to deal with something that isn't ideal. So that's turn 1. On turn 2, we're going to draw into some additional resources if we can. That might be at the beginning, that might be at the end of the turn. Depends on what you have. And then you're switching into your Growlithe, which we're going to evolve into Arcanine. We're attaching a DCE. We're using Buzz Zap off the Electrode, and we're ready to attack. But before we do that, we want to hit the opponent with a Lass to make sure they can't energy removal us. If they hit us with a super energy removal, that's probably game. We do have ways to rebuild, but it's going to be really bad for our tempo, so keep that in mind. We want to be lassing when we're ready to attack, okay? Also, if you play this deck more, the skill kind of really comes in with knowing what you can lose, how much more you can draw. It can win a game by kind of playing the long game, but that is very unlikely, but it can be done. Usually you're winning quickly or not at all. And remember, you can only set up your Arcanine 4 times. You only have 4 Electrodes and you only have 4 DCEs. There's no way to get those back in this deck minus Ghastly. Could get DCs back, but that's not the best plan per se. So really you only have 4 times to set this whole thing up. So this is what the deck looks like. As I said, the 9-Bomb thing comes from the Arcanine plus the bomb, the Buzz Zap kind of blowing itself up. Ophthalmoscope is kind of coined this deck list name, so I'll give him that credit. But we have our canines, we have our electrodes, we have the side decks we talked about. We also have that one of Ghastly. Ghastly helps us deal with Mime. Mime is not good for our deck, obviously. That's going to be tricky. It could also use that energy conversion late game to kind of get us back into it. I don't think that's a great backup plan, but it is a plan. But really, Ghastly's here as a free retreater and or to fight Mime. We also have 4 Lasses, which is unusual in most decks. That's because we have to hit it on turn 2 if we're doing the kind of ideal setup. We have all our draw pieces. Defender helps our canine stay in the game longer because it does do damage to itself. So that helps us take less damage on both our own attack and the opponent's. So pretty useful. And we also have traders. We've seen those in some others' lists that help us kind of set up our Pokemon. We have some stage 1s, but we're going to need a little bit of help to set that up. Now, Raindance. Raindance is trying to set up Blastoise very quickly. We'll talk more about that in a second. So that we can use the Raindance power so we can start attaching energy very quickly. That's kind of how it breaks the game, is by attaching energy quickly. And typically we have Blastoise that can attack, but more often than not we want to use Articuno. Articuno is a far better attacker, has no weakness, and it has a great resistance, especially in this format. Freeze Dry is a great starting attack. Getting Paralysis is great. Blizzard is also pretty good for doing some chip damage. That helps us work out some math on some of those big basics that we've talked about before as well. And we also have Lapras. Now, you might look at Lapras and say, why is this guy here? The reason is because our deck is going to struggle with Mime. Notice how Mime is a problem for combo decks. But Lapras does, a pretty consistent, 20 damage if we need it to. Confuse Ray also does some interesting things. Just kind of depends, but more typically than not, we can just Water Gun Mime twice to kill it. And Lapras also does have a pretty chunky bit of health as well. Keep that in mind. Finally, going to the trainers that are important to this deck. We've talked about Breeder a second ago. This is not really in any other decks because most decks don't need to evolve as quickly as we do. But we want that Blastoise turn 2 if possible. So Breeder is a must in this deck, and we can only set that up 4 times. Retrieval is also crucial in this deck. This deck is all about our water, what we have access to, how quickly we can power out, what we still have left. So Retrieval is not something you want to lightly throw away. There may be cases when you have to, but it's very integral to this deck. And then once again, the computer search is kind of here to represent all of the draw effects. This deck's going to be drawing a lot too, maybe not as much as 9 Bomb, because Raindance can play a little bit of a longer game, but it's not necessarily something we want to do. I mean, depending on the matchup, you got to feel for it, okay? Things you want to keep in mind when you're playing this deck. Like I said before, you want to know how much water you have access to at all times. Check the discard pile. That's a great place for information. Also, your opponents. If we identify that we're playing against a deck that will have Mime or could have Mime, don't ditch those Laprases. We need those. You could use Squirtle to deal with Mime. It's not a great place to be in. We want Lapras if we see Psychic and Mime's a possibility. Keep in mind, beefy basics, as I call them, are going to be a problem. That's like your Kangaskhan's, your Lickitungs. So know if you're going to have to deal with those. Because, as I said before, Articuno's attacks are good, but they only add up to about 80 damage if you're using one of each. So you might have to Blizzard twice, which gets a little tricky. So know what attacks you're going to have to use. And you might have to switch to Blastoise because Blastoise does 60 damage, 10 more than Articuno, and with plus power, it does an additional 10, so it can do 70 and kill basics like Hitmonchan, which is something Articuno can't do with a plus power. So you might have to think about what am I going to have to do, because you might have to attack with Blastoise, just kind of depends. But Articuno does math pretty well with the ability to possibly use that Freeze Dry to paralyze something and then Blizzard and kill it. So pretty great combination of attacks because you have that possibility of paralysis. As I said before, once again, to reiterate, know your water count. Don't ditch those retrievals if you don't have to. Those are precious. There are cases where you have to, but I can't stress enough, know your water count. So this is what the full deck looks like. It's just called Raindance based off Blastoise's power. Doesn't have a super fun name yet. But as you see, we also have very few basics as well, so this deck does tend to give up mulligans, which can be a problem, but honestly, if you're going fast enough, it might not matter too much. Notice my version of this deck doesn't have any War Turtles. A lot run one War Turtle just in case. Here we're not doing that. but I mean, there's different versions of this deck. This is not the end all be all by any means, okay? This is just what I like. Then we have lots of draw. Super Potions also in this deck, not in many decks, just because if you do have a big attacker powered up and going, you want that thing to keep going. So that's why we have Super Potion. And then we have a lot of those one-of standard trainers. And notice the 16 water count. You're going to want to keep that in mind, as I said before. So combo decks, I would not recommend them being your first deck, especially 9-Bomb. I think that Blastoise is a little more resilient and a little more forgiving. But 9-Bomb is fun, so I'm not going to say don't ever play that, but I would not suggest it as your first deck. So, wrapping up this series, if you're not on the Discord, jump on there. I'm kind of putting together a list maybe of some additional tips for beginners, kind of like an intermediate tips to playing the game that I might be putting out next. I'm also going to be doing some more like actual play videos of some other weird decks. But once again, if you have any comments, suggestions, post them down below. Let me know what you guys need to see. Let me know what you guys need help with, okay? But I hope to see you around. Play some games of Pokemon, TCG1, have some fun. Bye.